Imagine waking up one morning to find that the country you've lived in your entire life no longer exists. Its flag taken down, its leaders gone, its name wiped off the map. That's exactly what happened in 2023 to more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh,
raising fears of all-out war.
a place most of the world barely noticed until it was too late. And the way this tiny mountain region disappeared says more about the future of international politics than any headline about great powers of the summit meetings ever could.
This is the end of
Because what happened here is not an isolated tragedy. It's a warning sign about how borders, rights, and the very idea of self-determination are ever-changing in real time, and how powerful countries quietly set the rules when no one is looking. To understand why this matters, we need to step back to the early 20th century. The South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia were a jigsaw puzzle of overlapping ethnic groups, languages, and old empires. When the Russian Empire collapsed after World War I, Armenians and Azerbaijanis fought bitterly over Nagorno-Karabakh, a mostly Armenian enclave surrounded by what would become Azerbaijan. In the 1920s, the new Soviet authorities made a decision that still echoes today. They placed Nagorno-Karabakh inside the Azerbaijan Soviet Republic, granted it autonomy. For decades that arrangement held, not because it solved anything, but because Moscow's power froze the conflict in place. Fast forward to the 1980s, as the Soviet Union weakened, Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh began demanding unification with Armenia. The Soviet center hesitated, local clashes turned violent, and when the USSR collapsed, all restraint vanished. The First Nagorno-Karabakh War from 1991 to 1994 left tens of thousands dead and more than 1 million people displaced on both sides. Armenian forces, backed informally by Armenia itself, took control of the enclave and 7 surrounding districts. Territory internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan but ruled by what called itself the Republic of Artsakh. For nearly 3 decades, this unrecognized state lived in a strange limbo. No UN seat, no formal recognition from any country, but functioned government, schools, elections, and even its own army. If this sounds familiar, it should. It's the same pattern we see in other frozen conflicts. Transnistria in Moldova, Dacia in South Ossetia and Georgia, Northern Cyprus, and Somaliland. Places where local identity and history clash with international law, and where big powers prefer stalemate to hard choices. But while most of the world stopped paying attention, balance of power around Karabakh quietly shifted. Azerbaijan spent the 2000s transforming itself. Fueled by oil and gas revenues, it rebuilt its military with modern drones and precision weapons, buying heavily from Turkey and Israel. Armenia stagnated economically and politically. Its army still relied on aging Soviet equipment, and its alliance with Russia, as a guarantee of security, grew unreliable as Moscow's own crises deepened. When war returned in 2020, the results were decisive. In 6 weeks, Azerbaijan recaptured most of the surrounding districts and part of Karabakh itself. A Russia-brokered ceasefire left a rump Armenian-controlled region protected only by a thin line of Russian peacekeepers. For the people of Artsakh, this was a turning point. Many still believed autonomy inside Azerbaijan could be negotiated. But then came 2023. Baku imposed a months-long blockade, cutting off food, medicine, and fuel. When Azerbaijan launched a final offensive that September, Russian forces stood aside. Within days, the de facto government surrendered. Overnight, the Republic of Artsakh announced it would dissolve by January 1st, 2024. An entire political entity, one that had survived for 3 decades, was now gone. But why should the rest of the world care? Because Nagorno-Karabakh exposes a question every international dispute eventually faces. How do we balance a population's wish for self-rule with the principle that borders shouldn't be changed by force? International law contains both ideas. In practice, though, states and institutions must weigh them case by case. That tension, or simple villain or hero, is the real story. Supporters of Azerbaijan emphasized that the region was recognized as part of their country by the entire international community and that hundreds of thousands of their own citizens were displaced in the 1990s. Many Armenians countered that generations of cultural and family ties gave Karabakh's residents a distinct identity and a desire for autonomy. Each side carries history, losses, and legitimate concerns. Acknowledging that complexity is not sense-setting, it's the only way to understand why the conflict endured so long and why compromise proved so hard. Outside powers added another layer. Russia, the EU, the United States, and regional neighbors all had strategic interests: energy, trade routes, security, yet none were willing or able to impose lasting settlement. Instead of a grand conspiracy, what we see is a familiar pattern of international politics, many actors with limited influence, each constrained by their own priorities. The broader lesson is less about who won and more about how fragile long-term ceasefire can be when they depend on a single patron or when economic and military balances shift. We can see echoes of this dynamic in places as different as the Balkans, the Korean Peninsula, or the Horn of Africa. Where unresolved borders meet changing power dynamics, the risk of sudden change is always present. For countries and communities in similar situations, the case underscores a few practical realities. Diverse alliances matter more than any one protector. Economic resilience can shape security as much as weapons, and dialogue, however imperfect, is the only sustainable path if people on both sides are to coexist after the fighting stops. And there's another point often overlooked that deserves attention. Despite decades of conflict, the region's cultures remain deeply intertwined. Music, food, architecture, and family ties cross modern borders. Those connections outlast military victories and political declarations by a mile. Recognizing that and preserving that shared heritage may ultimately do more for peace than any treaty ever could. So when we look at Nagorno-Karabakh, we don't just see a vanished republic or a military campaign. See how history, identity, resources, and diplomacy combine in ways that rarely fit neat headlines. It reminds us that international law is not a set of automatic switches but a framework we continually negotiate. It reminds us too that understanding conflict means listening to every side, including ordinary people who simply want security and dignity. The question then is not whether there will be more disputed territories, there will be, obviously, but how the world can handle them without repeating the cycle of isolation, sudden violence, and mass displacement. That requires patient diplomacy, respect for local voices, and a willingness to accept complexity instead of easy narrative. Nagorno-Karabakh is a difficult story, but it doesn't have to be a hopeless one. It can serve as a case study in how communities and nations might build more flexible arrangements. Special autonomy, shared administration, cross-border institutions, so that identity and security are protected without new wars. The fact that such models are hard does not make them impossible. If there is a takeaway for viewers far away from the Caucasus, it is this. International stability depends less on choosing sides and more on understanding how competing principles, territorial integrity, self-determination, human rights, interact in the real world. Only by examining conflicts with that balance in mind can we learn anything useful for the next crises. If you enjoyed my video, consider subscribing, as it helps a ton in making people look at the hard work I do in my videos. I don't use AI, by the way. And yeah, thank you for watching.